Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll gain confidence, clarity, and a competitive edge in a crowded marketplace so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Gratzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm digging into the European Accessibility Act, which must be implemented before June 28th of this year. Now, if you're outside of the EU and you think this doesn't apply to you, then listen up, because it's not just for companies that are inside the EU. Now, in case you haven't heard of the European Accessibility Act, let's go over the basics. The European Accessibility Act, or the EAA, is also referred to as Directive EU 2019/882, and it's a directive of the European Union that became law in 2019. Its goal is to improve the accessibility of products and services for people with disabilities, but also people with functional limitations, such as elderly people and pregnant women. But they even mention people traveling with luggage. This is also expected to help economies and cross-border trade and mobility. The directive aims to do this by streamlining accessibility standards across all of the EU's 27 member states. So, what does the EAA actually apply to? Well, it applies to certain products and services. Some of them are computers and operating systems, ATMs and payment terminals, ticketing and check-in machines, smartphones, equipment for digital television and phone services, websites and mobile services, including ebooks and e-readers, access to audiovisual media services, any services related to air, bus, rail, and water passenger transport, and banking services and e-commerce. Now, it does not apply to certain digital content, such as pre-recorded time-based media that was published before June 28th, 2025, or Office file formats published before June 28th, 2025. And I'm not even entirely sure what Office file formats refers to. It also refers to online maps and mapping services if essential information is provided in an accessible digital manner for the maps intended for navigational use. And then third-party content that is not funded, developed by, or under the control of the economic operator that's concerned. And then content of websites and mobile apps that qualify as archives, meaning they only include content that is not updated or edited after June 28th, 2025. Now let's talk about who the EAA applies to. But first off, don't confuse the EAA with EU Directive 2016/2102. That relates to accessibility requirements for websites and mobile apps for the public sector, such as for the government. The EAA, though, applies to private sector businesses inside and outside of the EU that provide services or sell products to consumers within the EU. Now, there are actually two circumstances for exemptions under the EAA. And one of those is companies with 10 or fewer employees with an annual balance sheet of less than 2 million euros. Now, some businesses meeting certain criteria may be able to show a disproportionate burden and be exempted as well. Okay, so when does the EAA go into effect? Well, the EU member states are required to adopt and publish certain laws, regulations, and administrative provisions for compliance by June 28th, 2025. And they must actually fully implement the EAA requirements as well. All right, so now we know the what and the who and the when, but what about the accessibility standard, like the WCAG standard that you need to meet for the EAA? Well, the EAA itself does not state any specific accessibility standard. However, the European standard EN 301549, there's a lot of numbers and letters in this episode. That one applies to websites, mobile apps, and electronic documents, like PDFs, Word documents, etc. Now, that calls for WCAG 2.1 AA, but it is being updated to the current standard, which was released in October 2023, which is WCAG 2.2. So how will the EAA even be enforced? Well, the European Commission, the executive branch of the EU, will work with disability organizations and other groups to make sure that businesses are adhering to the EAA. They will perform regular checks. And not only that, but the EU member states also have to submit reports about the status of their compliance. So how they are meeting the accessibility requirements. And they have to do that by June 28th, 2030, and every 5 years after that. Consumers, though, can also file complaints. So what happens if a company does not comply with the European Accessibility Act? Well, here's where it gets tricky. It will be up to each member state to determine any specific fines and penalties for noncompliance. The Act states the penalties provided for shall be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. Those penalties shall also be accompanied by effective remedial action in case of noncompliance of the economic operator. In Rian Rietveld's talk about the EAA at WordCamp Europe, she mentioned a couple of cases as examples of what to expect. One of them was a case with Spanish airline Vueling. The National Court of Spain fined them 90,000 euros for not having an accessible website. Not only that, but they were prohibited from receiving any kind of public funds for 6 months. The second example was Ireland's accessibility law. Their penalties could be a fine of up to 5,000 euros and or imprisonment for up to 6 months for what's called a summary conviction, or a fine of up to 60,000 euros and or imprisonment for up to 18 months for an indicted conviction. So how can you and your clients comply with the EAA? Well, I'm not a lawyer, of course, and you should consult with one about compliance. And remember, compliance and conformance are two different matters, and compliance goes beyond a website, app, or a document conforming to accessibility guidelines. But disability rights lawyer Lainey Feingold has some helpful information about EU laws and specific countries on her website, lflegal.com. But there are some things that you can do to help make websites, apps, and digital documents conform to accessibility guidelines and practices. First, you want to make sure that all websites have an accessibility statement. An accessibility statement typically includes the level of conformance that you're aiming for, right? So WCAG 2.2 AA, for example, the company's plan and their time frame for implementing accessibility. So we could talk about auditing, remediation, and so forth, and then contact information for reporting any accessibility issues. Now, in Clause 81, the EAA specifically mentions that companies must talk about how a service conforms to accessibility requirements in its terms and conditions. So maybe that could be included in the accessibility statement. Then you also want to get websites, apps, and electronic documents audited, or just go straight to having them remediated. Audits usually involve an assessment and a report, and those both take a lot of time and they come at a high cost, and they don't fix anything. That takes additional time and cost. Remediating means diving right into fixing the issues. Now, accessibility is not set it and forget it, so ongoing monitoring is really important. So some things you can do are, continue to monitor the state of the website and electronic documents that are on it, and assess the accessibility of any technical updates to the website, right? Themes and plugins, and especially forms. And check the accessibility of any newly added or newly edited pages or posts, and then any images and audio and video that get added to the site too. Then you also want to check the accessibility of digital documents, PDFs, Word documents, PowerPoint files, and so forth, before they even get published on the site. And of course, it's best for anyone working on a website or creating digital documents to have accessibility training. Anyone who maintains the technical aspects of the site, updates the content on the site, creates documents for the site, all those people should be trained. If you're a website designer or developer or a document designer, you can work with an accessibility specialist to help these efforts if you don't have the skills, or if there's simply a lot of work to do and you just want to get it done faster. But you can learn how to do this too, and you can get up to speed quickly with my plain English accessibility training and straightforward processes. Check out my Foundations of Website Accessibility course and accessible PDFs from InDesign course at creative-boost.com/courses. If this was helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.